She thought she was hugging her brother. But she was wrong. Wren was a poor bakery girl, carrying the whole world on her shoulders. Lucian Ferrante owned half of Chicago, yet for 24 years not a single soul had dared to touch him with tenderness. The moment Wren accidentally threw her arms around the Mafia boss and whispered the very last words his mother ever spoke, everything changed completely. Before you step into this dark world, support us with a like and a subscribe. Let's see what happens. Wren was the kind of girl so used to carrying the whole world on her back that she never once let anyone carry her. Between night shifts at an airport bakery and the ever-rising stack of hospital bills for her older brother, she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be held, to hear someone tell her that everything would be all right. That snowstorm night, in the crowd at the terminal, she caught sight of a familiar back turned toward her. The same gray overcoat, the same build, the same dark hair, and she ran to him, wrapped her arms around him from behind, rested a hand on the back of his neck, and whispered the very words her mother used to say, "You're home now, you're safe, everything's going to be all right." She had no idea the man in her arms was not her brother. And he, the man this whole city dared touch only with fear, the man who had let no one close for all those years, went utterly still the moment that stranger's hand came to rest on the back of his neck, and spoke the words only his late mother had ever spoken. And the ice in the Iron Man's chest began to crack. What happens when the warmest heart in the city collides with its coldest man? Let's find out. The terminal smelled of wet wool and burnt coffee, and Wren Callahan stood near the arrivals gate with her hands buried in the sleeves of a coat 2 sizes too big, watching the departures board blur behind a film of exhaustion she could no longer blink away. She had been awake for nearly 19 hours, most of them behind the bakery counter, and the storm outside had turned every flight into a delayed promise. Elliot's plane had finally landed. That was all she could hold in her mind, the single warm thought she carried through the cold, that her brother was home, that she could stop bracing for the phone call she dreaded every hour he was away. Passengers spilled through the gate in coats dusted with snow, and somewhere in that river of strangers she saw him, or thought she did, a tall figure in a gray overcoat, with the same broad shoulders and the same dark hair, standing with his back to her, exactly the way Elliot always stood when he was scanning a crowd for her face. Relief cracked her open like ice giving way. She did not think. She never thought when it came to him. She crossed the distance in a rush of footsteps, wrapped both arms around him from behind, pressed her cheek between his shoulder blades, and let one hand settle at the back of his neck, the way their mother had once done for both of them, and she whispered the words that had lived in her family longer than she had. "You're home now. You're safe. Everything's going to be all right." For a heartbeat the world felt whole again, and then she felt him go rigid beneath her hands, not the flinch of a man startled by a stranger, but something deeper and stranger than that, a stillness so total it frightened her, as though her palm against his neck had reached in and closed around something he had spent his whole life keeping locked. His breath stopped. Beneath her fingers she felt the pulse in his throat leap and hammer, quick and uneven, and she realized with slow dawning horror that the body she was holding was wrong, the chest too solid, the frame too still, and the scent all wrong, not the familiar smell of her brother but something expensive and unfamiliar, sandalwood and cold air, and the faint bite of costly tobacco. She let go as if she had been burned. She stumbled back a step, then 2, her heart climbing into her throat, and when the man turned to face her she forgot how to breathe. He was not Elliot. He was no one she knew. He was, in fact, the sort of man she would have remembered, older than her brother by only a few years, yet carrying a weight in his face that had nothing to do with age. Sharp cheekbones, and a faint scar tracing his jaw and eyes, the pale gray of a storm about to break. And those eyes were fixed on her with an expression she could not read, something between shock and disbelief, the look of a man who had seen a ghost walk out of a crowd and put its hand on him. For a moment neither of them moved, then the panic arrived all at once. "Oh God," she breathed. "Oh God, I am so sorry. I thought you were my brother. I swear I thought you were my brother. He has the same coat, the same... Oh God, I did not. I would never just... I am so sorry." Her words tumbled over one another, tripping and useless, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth as if she could shove them back in. The man said nothing. He only kept looking at her, and there was something in that silence heavier than any words, as if he were trying to place her, or place the sound of what she had whispered, as if a single sentence had undone 24 years of careful stone. Before she could dig herself any deeper, a shape moved in from the side, broad and dark and quick, a man in a black coat who stepped between them with the unhurried certainty of someone whose whole job was standing between his boss and the world. "Is there a problem here?" the man said, low, his eyes already measuring her for a threat, and then, glancing back, "Mr. Ferrante, are you all right?" The name landed in her chest like a dropped stone. Ferrante. She did not know the man. Not truly. But she knew the name the way everyone in certain neighborhoods of Chicago knew it. A name spoken quietly, in kitchens and back rooms. A name that meant, "Do not ask." A name that arrived attached to fear. The color drained from her face. She looked from the bodyguard to the man in the gray coat, and understood, too late, exactly whose neck her hand had been resting on. She started, and found she had nothing left, no clever thing, no explanation that would not sound insane, so she did the only thing her body knew how to do, when the ground gave way beneath her, the thing she had done her whole life. She ran. She turned and pushed back into the crowd, into the noise and the wet wool smell, and the mercy of anonymous strangers, not looking back, her pulse roaring in her ears, telling herself she would never see him again, that people like her, and men like that, lived in different worlds that did not touch. But behind her, Lucian Ferrante did not move. He stood exactly where she had left him, one hand rising slowly to the back of his own neck, to the warmth her palm had left there, and he stared after the place where she had vanished long after she was gone. 24 years, he thought. 24 years, and no one had touched him like that. No one had dared. No one had even tried. And a girl whose name he did not yet know had just walked out of the snow, put her hand on the oldest wound he had, and spoken the last words his mother ever said to him. The penthouse at the top of the Ferrante building was all glass and silence, and Lucian Ferrante stood at the window long after midnight with a drink he had not touched, watching the snow erase the city he was said to own. He did not sleep. He rarely did, not because power kept him awake, but because the quiet was when the past came for him, and tonight it had arrived early, ushered in by a stranger's hand. He could still feel it. That was the thing he could not explain away, could not bury under work, or discipline, or the cold machinery of the life he ran, the ghost of a palm against the back of his neck, warm and certain, and 5 words spoken into his coat that he had not heard in 24 years. "You're home now. You're safe." His mother used to say them. Elena Ferrante, who smelled of bread and orange peel, who hummed in the kitchen, who had put her hand on the back of his neck the way you steady something precious, and who had put that same hand there on the last night of her life, folding her small body over his in the back of a car, while the world came apart around them, whispering those exact words, so that they would be the last thing he heard instead of the noise, so that he would remember warmth instead of what took her. He had been 10 years old. He had grown up the rest of the way in his father's house, a house with no softness in it, learning to be the kind of man no one touched with tenderness, because tenderness was a door, and doors got you killed. Under his shirt, against his chest, hung a small worn medal of Saint Christopher, the patron of travelers and of coming home, the one thing of hers he had never taken off, and now his thumb found it in the dark, and pressed until the edge bit into his skin, as if pain could organize the thing that had come loose in him tonight. "Find her," a part of him said, before he had decided anything, and he hated how much he meant it. Behind him a door opened without a knock, and only one man in the world was permitted that. Tommaso Greco was old enough to have advised Lucian's father, and wise enough to have survived him. A heavy, unhurried man, with kind eyes and a lawyer's caution. The closest thing to a father Lucian had left. "You did not come down for the Bianchi meeting," Tom said quietly, setting a folder on the table. "Which is not like you." And Salvatore noticed, "Which is worse." Lucian did not turn from the window. Let him notice. Tom studied the back of his employer's head for a long moment, reading the stillness there, the way other men read faces. "Something happened tonight," he said. "Not a question." "It was nothing," Lucian answered, and they both knew it was a lie. Down the hall, in a room where he did not belong, Salvatore Bianchi had waited a full hour for a boss who never came, and old men like Sal did not forget slights. They filed them, they let them harden, and as he pulled on his coat to leave, he told the two capos beside him, with the patient venom of a man who had run this city's uglier business since before the boy was born, that a leader who let himself be distracted was a leader who could be replaced, and that he would be watching to see what, or who, had turned Lucian Ferrante's head. None of them said the word out loud, but it settled over the room all the same, cold and waiting. Across the city, in a narrow apartment on the south side where the radiator knocked and never quite warmed, Wren was not sleeping either. She had gotten Elliot home from the airport and into bed, and she sat now at the edge of his mattress, the way she had 100 nights before, listening to the wet rattle in his breathing and pretending not to hear it. He had waved off her worry with a joke, the way he always did, but during the night she had heard him coughing in the bathroom and had found, after, the small bright evidence he had tried to rinse away, and she had said nothing, because saying it out loud made it real, and she could not afford for it to be real. Not yet. On the refrigerator, the bills were held up by mismatched magnets, layered like scales, the ones stamped in red on top, from the hospital, from the transplant center out of state, from the endless small mercenaries of being poor and sick in America. Taped beside them, curling at the corner, was a photograph she could not bring herself to take down, a faded picture of a little corner shop with her father in the doorway, and a hand-painted sign above it, Callahan's, the place her parents had built and her father had died inside, the place a fire had taken, along with everything that came before it, the place her brother had carried her out of, and paid for with the lungs that were failing him now. She had been a girl who was going to cook, once. She had been a girl who was engaged, once, until the bills came, and the man she thought she loved discovered he had signed on for something lighter than this, and left without much of an argument. She had learned by now not to expect anyone to carry her, and so she carried instead, one shift at a time, one bill at a time, one breath of her brother's at a time. She pressed her cold hands together and thought, absurdly, of the man in the gray coat at the airport, of the way he had gone so still under her hands, of the raw and stricken look in those storm-colored eyes, as if she had hurt him without meaning to, and she felt her face heat with fresh humiliation and pushed the memory away. She would never see him again. Men like that did not come to places like hers. She turned off the lamp, and in the dark the two of them breathed, the girl who carried everyone, and the man who let no one close, each unaware that the other lay awake across the same sleeping city, each with the ghost of the same 5 words pressed against the back of the neck. 3 days later, Wren had almost convinced herself the whole thing at the arrivals gate had been a fever dream born of 19 hours awake, the kind of embarrassment you file away and never speak of, when she looked up from the espresso machine at the Sunrise Bakery counter and felt the floor tilt, because there he was. Lucian Ferrante stood on the other side of the pastry case, in a charcoal coat with snow still melting on the shoulders, and he was looking at her the way a man looks at a thing he has been thinking about, and Wren wanted, sincerely and with her whole heart, for the earth to open and swallow her whole. Of all the coffee counters in all the terminals in all of Chicago, she thought, and could not decide whether to laugh or hide in the walk-in cooler. He did not pretend not to know her. That was the first surprising thing about him. "Well," he said, his voice low and even, the sort of voice that made people lean in without deciding to, the neck of a stranger. And now the woman pouring my coffee, and Wren felt her face go hot and lifted her chin, because the only defense she had ever owned was her mouth. "I promise I am not following you," she said. "This is my counter. I was here first, and if anyone is doing the ambushing, it is the man who keeps turning up wherever I happen to be standing." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth that on another man might have grown into a smile. "I fly through here often," he said. "The hotels near the airport are mine," which is a duller explanation than fate but happens to be true. Wren picked up a cup because her hands needed something to do that was not shaking. "What can I get you, Mr. Ferrante?" she said, putting a careful, professional distance into the name, and he studied her for a moment before answering. "Black coffee," he said, and then, "Whichever pastry you think is the best one." She paused. People did not usually ask her that. People pointed at the glass and grunted and looked at their phones. "And whichever I think is best," she repeated. "So if I hand you the day-old scone, you have no one to blame but yourself." And this time the almost smile made it all the way, brief and dry. "I will take my chances," he said. She made his coffee, and, after a small, stubborn hesitation, chose the cinnamon roll from the back. The ones she proofed slow so the middle stayed soft, the recipe that had been her mother's before it was hers, and she set it in front of him without ceremony. "That one," she said. He looked at it, and then at her, and did not touch it yet. While he stood there, a small commotion unfolded at the end of the counter. An elderly woman in a thin coat counting coins into her palm with trembling fingers, murmuring that she had missed her connection, and did not have quite enough, that it was fine, that she would just wait, and Wren was already moving before the woman finished, sliding a coffee and a warm roll across the counter, and saying easily, "On the house we always make too many on storm nights. You would be doing me a favor eating it so I do not have to throw it out," which was a lie, and a kind one, and she said it so smoothly that the old woman's shame had no time to bloom before it was replaced by gratitude. Wren did not look to see if anyone had noticed. She never did. But Lucian Ferrante had noticed, and something moved behind those storm-gray eyes, quiet and unfamiliar, because in his world every gift was a ledger entry, and every kindness came with a hook in it, and he had just watched a girl with red bills on her refrigerator give away food she could not afford to lose, to a stranger who would never repay her, and expect nothing, and hide that she had done it at all. He put money on the counter, far more than the coffee cost, and when she tried to make change, he was already walking away. The next morning he was back, and the morning after that. Same time, the gray light before the terminal filled, same order, black coffee, and whichever pastry she thought was best, and always he waited until she was the one to bring it, waving off the other girl behind the counter, with a small shake of his head that was not rude, but was not negotiable either. Wren told herself it meant nothing, that a powerful man's routines were his own strange business, that he probably did this at every counter in every terminal, but she began, without permitting herself to admit it, to set aside the good cinnamon roll before he arrived, the soft one from the back, and to feel a small ridiculous flare of something in her chest when the gray coat came through the crowd at the hour she had started, against all sense, to expect it. "You have a regular," the other counter girl teased her on the fourth morning, watching Wren fuss with the pastry case. "And do you know who that even is?" And Wren said she did not, which was the second kind lie of the week, and busied herself with the coffee so no one would see her face, and did not let herself wonder why a man the whole city whispered about kept choosing, every single morning, the loneliest counter in the airport and the girl behind it. The mornings collected into something like a habit, and though Wren would have denied it under oath, she had stopped bracing for him and started expecting him, until on the second week, on a gray morning when the terminal was nearly empty and the storm had thinned to a slow drift, Lucian set his coffee down without drinking it, and said the thing she had spent 2 weeks praying he would never say. "That night at the gate," he said quietly, "when you thought I was your brother," and Wren felt her whole body tighten around the memory. "Please," she said, "I have been trying very hard to forget that happened," and he did not smile this time. "You said something," he went on, as though she had not spoken. "Your hand was here, And he lifted his own and touched the back of his neck. And you said certain words, and I have not been able to stop hearing them. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw that whatever this was for him, it was not teasing, that under the stillness there was something almost like need, and it disarmed her more than any charm could have. It was my mother's, she said finally, the words coming slower than she meant them to. The way you say a thing you have kept in a locked drawer. She used to do it, the hand, the words. When Elliot and I were small and something had scared us, she would put her hand right there and say, "You're home now, you're safe, everything's going to be all right." And somehow when she said it you believed it, even when it was not true, especially when it was not true. She swallowed. She has been gone a long time. I do it without thinking now. I did it to you without thinking, which is the whole tragedy of it. I reached for my brother and got the most dangerous man in Chicago instead. She had meant it to land as a joke, to close the drawer again, but Lucian did not laugh, and the silence that came after was not empty, it was full, so full she could hardly stand in it. When he spoke his voice had changed, gone low and careful, stripped of all the dry armor she had come to expect. My mother used to say them too, he said. Wren went very still. The same words, he said, the same hand, the exact same, here, and again his fingers rose to the back of his own neck, as though the memory lived in the skin there. Every night when I was a boy, until I was 10. And then he stopped, and Wren waited, and he did not finish the sentence the way people finish sentences. He only said, and then she was gone. 4 small words with a whole collapsed world folded inside them. And something in the way he said gone told her not to ask how, told her that how was a country he did not travel to, out loud. And for the first time since the airport, since the name, since she had learned to see him the way the whole city saw him, Wren did not see the man they whispered about. She did not see the gray suits or the bodyguard, or the fear that walked in front of him like a herald. She saw a boy of 10 standing in a house that had stopped saying "you're safe." A boy who had been touched with fear ever since, because tenderness had walked out the door with his mother and never come back, and her chest ached with a recognition so sharp it frightened her, because she knew that boy. She had one just like him rattling in the next bed at night. She had been one herself. "I'm sorry," she said, and she did not say it the polite way, the counter way. She said it the way you say it to someone standing in the same wreckage you are standing in, and he heard the difference. She watched him hear it. They stood there with the pastry case humming between them and the snow falling soft beyond the glass. 2 people who had learned the same lullaby from 2 women neither of them could get back. And it was Wren who broke it, gently, because she could not bear the size of what was in the air. "Is that why," she said, "why you keep coming to the loneliest counter in this whole airport and letting a stranger pick your breakfast?" And it was not really a question about breakfast, and they both knew it. Lucian looked at her for a long moment. "Maybe I like being reminded," he said, "that someone in this city is still capable of that, of putting a hand on a stranger and meaning safe by it." And he picked up the cinnamon roll she had set aside for him, the soft one from the back, and this time he ate it, there at the counter, slowly, the way a man eats something that has more in it than flour and sugar. And Wren turned to wipe down a machine that did not need wiping because she did not trust her own face. When she looked back, he had left money on the counter as always, too much as always. But this time, there was something else beside the cup, a napkin, with a line written on it in a hard, precise hand. "Have dinner with me," not a demand, not quite. More like a man leaving a door open and walking away before he could watch it stay shut. And Wren stood there holding it long after the gray coat had disappeared into the crowd, telling herself all the reasons the answer had to be no, and knowing, in the treacherous quiet under her ribs, that she had already started saying yes. The car came on Friday exactly as he had promised, and Wren spent the whole ride certain she was making a mistake, certain she would be walked into some gleaming marble place full of people who could smell where she came from. And she was already rehearsing how she would hold her chin up through it, when the car stopped instead outside a small unmarked door on a quiet street. A place with no sign and warm light in the windows and only a handful of tables inside, The kind of restaurant that did not need to announce itself because the people who belonged there already knew, and she understood, stepping in out of the cold, that he had chosen it precisely so she would not feel swallowed, and the thoughtfulness of it undid some of her armor before she had even sat down. He rose when she came to the table, which no one had done for her in years, and she said, before she lost her nerve, "I almost did not come," and he said, "I know. I could see you deciding not to for the last 3 days," and she laughed despite herself and sat. The prices, when she opened the menu out of nervous habit, made her stomach drop, and she must have made a face because he said, without looking up, "Do not. I did not bring you here to watch you do arithmetic," and she put the menu down and said, "All right, but I am ordering for myself. I do not trust a man who orders for a woman," and something like approval moved across his face. They talked. That was the thing she had not expected, that it would be easy, that the most feared man in Chicago would turn out to be, across a small table with the snow starting again outside, simply good company, dry and observant and quicker to listen than to speak. He told her, slowly, more than he had at the counter, about Elena, about a kitchen that smelled of orange peel and bread, about a woman who had married into a world she never chose and spent her short life trying to keep her son on the soft side of it, about how she had lost that fight in the end, and how the house had gone quiet and cold after her and never warmed again. "I was raised the rest of the way to be useful to it," he said. "This life, I did not choose it any more than she did. You are handed a name like mine, and the name decides everything. Who you are, who fears you, who you are allowed to love, and by the time you are old enough to want out the door has already closed behind you." Wren listened and heard, under the calm of it, the sound of a cage, and when he asked her in turn what she would have chosen if the world had ever once asked her, she found herself telling him the thing she told no one, about the little corner shop in the photograph on her refrigerator, Callahan's, her father's place, the smell of it on a winter morning, the way her whole childhood had lived inside those walls until the fire took it, and how somewhere under all the shifts and the bills, there was still a stubborn girl who dreamed of opening those doors again, of standing in her father's doorway with the sign repainted and the ovens warm, and how she had learned to keep that dream very small because small dreams hurt less when they die. "So we are the same then," he said quietly, "both of us prisoners of a life somebody else built for us," and the words sat between them with a strange gentleness, because it was true, and because neither of them had ever expected to hear it said out loud by someone who understood. When they left, the snow had thickened into a proper fall, and Wren had come without a real coat, because her real coat was not fit to be seen at a place like this, and she wrapped her arms around herself against the cold, and without a word, Lucian took off his own gray overcoat, the one that had started all of this, the one she had buried her face against by mistake at the airport, and settled it over her shoulders. It was warm from him, and it smelled of sandalwood and cold air, and she stood inside it feeling absurdly, dangerously safe, and because feeling safe frightened her, she reached for the old defense and said, "This is not some move, is it? The coat, buying the poor girl's gratitude one grand gesture at a time." And he looked down at her, unbothered, and said, "If I were trying to buy you, you would not have to ask. You would simply find yourself bought, and there was no charm in it, only a flat, dry honesty that was somehow more devastating than charm." And Wren opened her mouth to fire something back, and found she had nothing, because her heart had just done a small, treacherous, unmistakable thing, a stumble, a skip, a lurch toward a cliff she had sworn she would never go near again, and she thought, with real alarm, standing in a killer's coat in the falling snow, with her pulse gone loud in her ears, "This is not a good sign. This is not a good sign at all." The warmth of that night did not last a week, because the world Wren lived in had never once allowed her to keep a good thing for long, and it came apart on an ordinary Tuesday, when Elliot's breathing turned in the night from a rattle into something that would not catch, and she drove him to the emergency room with her hands white on the wheel, and her mind very calm in the way it always went calm when the worst was actually happening, saving the falling apart for later, for when he could not see it. The doctors stabilized him by morning, and that was the small mercy, but the one who came to speak with her afterward wore the careful face she had learned to dread, and closed the door, and told her the thing she had been outrunning for 2 years, that the scarring in her brother's lungs was moving faster now, that the medicine that had held the line was no longer holding it, that without a transplant, they were measuring what was left in a currency neither of them could afford to spend. She made herself ask the questions, the practical ones. The only way she knew how to stand inside bad news was to give it edges and numbers, and the answers were a wall, the procedure and everything around it costing more money than she could earn in years of gray mornings. And worse than the money, the doctor explained gently, was the matter of the list. That a transplant list is not a line you simply wait in. That a person's place on it can slip when his condition and his circumstances are weighed and found wanting. That a man without the right resources and the right support and the right everything can watch his own name drift down, while sicker and luckier people move ahead of him. And Wren sat very still and understood that being poor was not just going to make this hard, it was going to make it fatal. That the cruelty of it was engineered. That the system did not hate her brother, it simply had no room for someone who could not pay to matter. She did not cry in the office. She thanked the doctor, because that was what you did, and she signed the papers they gave her, and she walked down the hall to Elliot's room and put on the face, the bright unbothered face she had been wearing for him since she was a girl, and she sat on the edge of his bed and teased him about the hospital gown and told him the doctors said he was too stubborn to do anything on schedule. And he played along because he knew what she was doing and loved her too much to make her stop, and only once, when she thought he had drifted off, did he catch her hand and say quietly, "Wren, you do not have to carry this one alone." And she squeezed his fingers and lied, "I know, and I am not. Everything is handled, you just breathe and get strong." And he let her have the lie because it was the only thing she had left to give him. She held it together the whole way down in the elevator, and across the frozen lot, and into the old car that smelled of cold vinyl. And she got the key into the ignition, and then she stopped. And the engine did not start. And the falling apart she had been saving came for her all at once. And she folded forward over the steering wheel, and let it take her. The sobs coming ugly and silent and shaking, the 2 years of held breath and the red bills and the fire, and the empty side of the bed, and her father in the doorway of a shop that no longer existed, and her brother upstairs breathing on borrowed time, all of it, and she cried the way you only cry when there is no one to see, until there was nothing left. And then she wiped her face hard with the heel of her hand and sat up and looked at herself in the rearview mirror and said out loud, to the girl she had always had to be, "I'll handle it," the way she had handled everything, alone, because she did not know how to do it any other way, and did not believe, had never once been given a reason to believe, that anyone would ever come to help her carry it. And on the passenger seat, where she had thrown her bag, her phone lit up in the dark with a single message from a hard, precise hand she had started to know. "Good morning. No cinnamon roll today. Is everything all right?" And Wren looked at it for a long time in the cold car. The one person in the whole city who had asked her that in years, and did not answer, because pride was the last thing she owned outright, and she did not yet know that it was about to cost her the thing she loved most. She did not answer the message, but she went back to the counter the next morning because she could not afford to miss a shift, and Lucian was there at the gray hour as always, and one look at her face told him everything her silence had not. The swollen eyes she had tried to hide, the way she moved like a woman holding herself together with her hands, and he did not order coffee. He waited until the terminal thinned, and then he said, simply, "Tell me." And something in her was too tired to fight it, so she told him, flat and factual, about her brother's lungs, and the list and the number that had no relationship to any money she would ever hold. And she said it the way she said all her disasters, with edges instead of tears, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I will pay for it. All of it. The surgery and everything around it." And it was the plainness of it that broke something in her, the way he said it as though it were nothing, as though a life could be lifted off the ground with the ease of a man signing a check. And Wren felt not gratitude but a hot, rising fury, because she had spent her whole life being the sort of person things were done to, and she could not, be that here. "No," she said. "Wren," he began, and she cut him off, her voice low and shaking. "No, you do not understand. I am not a charity case. I am not a sad story you get to fix so you feel warm about yourself. Do you know what it costs to be the person who always needs saving? Do you have any idea? My brother ran into a fire for me when we were children, and he has been paying for it with his body every day since. Every breath he loses is a breath he spent on me. And you want me to just stand here and let one more person bleed themselves to carry me? I will not do it. I would rather lose everything the honest way than be owned the kind way." She was breathing hard when she stopped, half expecting him to be offended, half hoping he would be so she would have a reason to run. But he only looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, and there was no pity in them, which was the thing that kept her standing there. There was something closer to recognition, as though he understood pride because it was the one currency he had never had to spend, and had watched destroy men who had nothing else. "All right," he said finally. "Then not charity." And he was quiet a moment, thinking, and when he spoke again it was carefully, the way a man lays down a bridge he is not sure will hold. "I eat badly," he said, which was such an unexpected thing to say that she blinked. "I run a business that never sleeps. I keep terrible hours. I have a kitchen the size of your apartment that no one has cooked a real meal in for years, and I am tired of eating things brought to me in boxes by people I do not trust. Come and cook for me. 3 meals a day, at my house, for a season, real food, your food, the things you would have made in that shop of your father's, and I will pay you what the work is worth, which for a private cook of your particular talents is a great deal of money, enough, if you are careful, to cover what your brother needs." He let that settle, then added, in that dry, flat way that gave her nowhere to hide, "You work, I pay. It is a job, not a gift. And if it offends your pride to be helped, then let it soothe your pride to be hired." Wren stared at him, and she understood exactly what he was doing, understood that he had taken her one unbreakable rule and built her a door through it, that he was letting her keep the only thing she had left while handing her the only thing she needed, and the generosity of it, dressed up as a transaction so she could bear to accept it, was almost harder to survive than the cruelty of the world had been. "It is a real job," she said, testing it. "You actually want me to cook," and he said, "I actually want to stop eating out of boxes, and if along the way I get to see the face of the woman who gave a stranger her breakfast and hid it, that is my business and not part of your salary." She looked down at her hands, the calloused, flour-dusted hands that were the only inheritance her father had managed to leave her, and she thought of Elliot upstairs breathing on borrowed time, and of the girl in the rearview mirror who always said, "I'll handle it," and always handled it alone. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself set a small piece of the weight down, and it terrified her more than carrying it ever had. Every part of her wanted to run, the way she always ran when someone got close enough to help, and she felt her feet want to turn, and instead she made herself stand still, and she lifted her chin, and she looked the most dangerous man in Chicago in the eye, and said the word that would change everything, quietly, like stepping off a ledge, "Okay." The house sat behind a wall at the end of a long private drive, and Wren's first morning there she was stopped at a gate by men who checked her name against a list, and looked at her the way guards look at anything they have not yet decided is harmless. And she walked up to the door with her mother's knife roll under her arm, feeling like a trespasser in her own life, because everything inside was cold and immense, and beautiful in the way of things that were never meant to be touched. All pale stone and glass and silence, a fortress dressed as a home. The main kitchen, when a silent housekeeper showed her to it, was worse than she had feared. A vast expanse of steel and marble that had clearly never fed anyone, gleaming and unused and about as warm as an operating room, and Wren stood in the middle of it feeling her heart sink, because you cannot make a person's food in a place with no soul in it. She was about to resign herself to it when Lucian appeared in the doorway, and without a word he crossed the house and led her down a back hall to a door she would not otherwise have noticed, an old door with an old lock, and he took a key from his pocket that looked as though it had not been used in a very long time, and he opened it, and the room beyond stopped her breath. It was a small kitchen, an old one, plainer than the rest of the house by decades, with worn wooden counters and copper pots gone dark with disuse, and a window that looked out on the snow, and it smelled, faintly, under the dust, of orange peel, and Wren understood before he said anything, because the room had the particular stillness of a place kept exactly as someone left it. "This was hers," he said quietly. "My mother's. She cooked here. She would not use the big kitchen. She said it had no heart. And after, I closed it, and no one has been inside in 24 years. He set the key on the counter. "Use it," he said, and left before she could see his face. And Wren stood alone in Elena Ferrante's kitchen, with her own dead mother's knives in her hands, and felt the strange symmetry of it settle over her. 2 women gone, 2 children who kept them alive in recipes, and she rolled up her sleeves and got to work bringing the room back to life. She cleaned it first, gently, the way you tend something sacred, and then she cooked, and the smell of real food moved through that cold house for the first time in a generation. He never told her what he wanted. She would ask, and he would only say, "Surprise me," every time, until it became a small game between them, and she began to look forward to the moment his face registered whatever she had set in front of him, the way something guarded in him eased a fraction with the first bite. He started coming to the kitchen when he did not need to, leaning against the old door frame with his sleeves rolled and no jacket, watching her work, and they talked, easily, the way they had in the sleeping terminal, and the fortress began, in that one small room, to feel almost like a home. And then one gray afternoon, poking through the drawers of the old kitchen for a rolling pin, Wren found a notebook, its cover soft with handling, its pages filled with a looping hand and stains and marginal notes, Elena's recipes, and she turned the pages with careful fingers, and chose one, a simple braided sweetbread with orange in it, and she made it, because it felt like the right way to honor the room. And when the smell of it filled the house, Lucian came down the hall faster than she had ever seen him move, and stopped dead in the doorway, and he did not speak, he could not. He simply stood there with his hand rising to his chest, where the little St. Christopher medal hung under his shirt, his face open in a way she had never seen it, undone by a smell 24 years old, and Wren set down her spoon and did not say anything either, because some griefs do not want words, they want witnessing. The moment might have gone on longer if a voice had not cut through the house from the front hall, and Wren looked up as Lucian's whole posture changed, the softness sealing over instantly, the mask coming down, and he said, "Stay here," and went, and Wren, who should have stayed, drifted to the doorway with a dish towel in her hands and saw, across the great cold entrance hall, an old man in an expensive coat, heavy and unhurried, with eyes like 2 cold coins, saying something low to Lucian that she could not hear but could feel, the temperature of the room dropping around it. She did not know his name yet. She only knew that Lucian stood very straight before him, in a way he did before no one else, and that when the old man's gaze slid past Lucian's shoulder and found her standing in the doorway of a kitchen that had been closed for a generation, it lingered, and narrowed, and did something cold and calculating behind the eyes, marking her, measuring her, filing her away, and Wren felt a chill move down her spine that had nothing to do with the snow outside, the first breath of a danger she did not yet have a name for, and she stepped back out of sight, but it was already too late, because Salvatore Bianchi had seen exactly what he needed to see, that the untouchable son of the man he had served had let something soft into the house, and that soft things, in their world, were only ever used as a way in. The invitation was not really a request, Wren came to understand, when a dress arrived at her apartment a week later, in a box that cost more than her month's rent, along with a note in that hard, precise hand that said only, "I need you beside me Saturday. Wear this," and though every instinct told her to send it back, she also understood, by now, enough of his world to know that when a man like Lucian Ferrante appeared alone at a gathering of the families, it was read as weakness, and that he was asking her, in his sideways wordless way, to stand where a wife or an ally would stand. And so she put on the dress, deep gray like the color of his eyes, and she looked at the stranger in the mirror, and lifted her chin the way she always did, before something that frightened her. The gala was held in a ballroom that dripped with money, chandeliers, and old wealth, and men who smiled with everything but their eyes. And Wren felt the wrongness of it the moment she walked in on Lucian's arm, felt the room take note of her, felt the women in their jewels measure her, and find her origins showing through the expensive dress. And she kept her spine straight, and her face calm, and thought, I have served people like you cold coffee at 4 in the morning. I will not let you see me flinch. Lucian stayed close, quieter than usual, his hand light at the small of her back, steering her through the introductions like a man walking a friend through a minefield, and she was almost holding her own, when a woman crossed the room toward them with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once been made to feel out of place, tall and polished and beautiful in the cold way of a blade, and Wren felt Lucian go still beside her. Lucian, the woman said, her voice like poured silk, I did not expect to see you here with company, and her eyes went over Wren slowly, head to foot, cataloging the borrowed shine over the working-class bones. And how lovely, she added, though I do not think we have met. Which family are you from? And the question was a trap, and everyone within earshot knew it. Because Wren was from no family that mattered here, and the woman intended to make her say so out loud. This is Gia Castellano, Lucian said evenly, an old acquaintance, and Wren understood from the particular flatness of old acquaintance that there was history there, the kind that had once been arranged and never quite died, and Gia smiled, and pressed the knife in further. An acquaintance, is that what we are calling it? And turned back to Wren with false sweetness and said, You must tell me, dear, what is it you do? And Wren, who had taken quite enough, smiled back just as sweetly and said, I cook, I feed people, which I imagine is more than most of the people in this room have ever done for anyone, and a small shocked silence opened around them like a held breath. And into that silence, Lucian did something that changed everything, something the whole room saw and would repeat for weeks. He reached down and took Wren's hand, deliberately, and laced his fingers through hers, and held it, in full view of every family in the city, and he said, in that low voice that made people lean in, She is with me, and if anyone at this table has a question about who she is, they may address it to me, and no one did. Gia's smile did not survive it. She recovered, because women like her always recover, but the ground had shifted under her and she knew it, and she excused herself with cold grace and withdrew, and Wren stood there with her hand swallowed warm in his, and her heart pounding, not from fear now, but from the sheer unfamiliar force of being defended, of having someone step in front of her, instead of leaving her to carry the blow alone, and she did not trust herself to look at him. But across the ballroom, where the light did not quite reach, an old man with eyes like cold coins had watched the whole thing, and Salvatore Bianchi understood what he was seeing more clearly than the young couple did, that the untouchable Ferrante boy had just told an entire room he had a soft place, had shown them all exactly where the one weakness in his armor lived, and old men who had survived as long as Sal had did not see love when they looked at a thing like that. They saw a lever, and Sal had spent a lifetime learning where levers fit. That night he made a quiet call, and set his people to the simple patient work of learning everything there was to know about the girl in the gray dress, where she came from, who her people were, what she could be used for or frightened with, and it did not take them long, because Wren had never been anyone hard to trace. And when the answer came back to Salvatore Bianchi a few days later, he went very still, and then he smiled, a thin, cold smile, because the file on his desk said her name was Callahan, that she had grown up over a little corner shop on the south side, a shop that had burned when she was 15, a shop whose ashes he remembered better than most, because he was the man who had given the order to light it, And the old fixer sat back in his chair and understood that fate had handed him something rare and useful. That Lucian Ferrante had fallen for the daughter of a debt Sal himself had once collected in fire, and that a secret like that, placed correctly, could break the boy's heart and his rule in a single stroke. Word of the gala moved through the city the way such things did, in whispers and glances, and Wren felt the change before she understood it, the way the guards at the gate looked at her a little longer now, the way a black car seemed to sit across from her apartment some mornings, and be gone by the time she looked twice, the sense a person gets in their skin, long before their mind agrees, of having been noticed by something large and patient, and not friendly. She told herself it was nerves, the natural paranoia of a girl who had wandered too far into a world that was not hers, until the morning she came to open her counter at the Sunrise Bakery and found something waiting on it that had not been there when she locked up. Set square in the middle of the clean steel where she could not miss it, a small book of matches, plain and cheap, and beneath it, a single sheet of paper gone brown and brittle at the edges, scorched along one side as though it had been pulled half-burned from a fire, and when she turned it over with a hand that had started to shake, she saw that it was a menu, old and water-stained and burned, and across the top in a faded hand-painted script was a word that stopped her heart. Callahan's, her father's menu, from the shop that no longer existed, from the fire that had taken him. And she stood there in the empty terminal with the thing in her hands and did not understand what it meant, only that it was meant, that someone had gone to the trouble of finding a relic of the worst day of her life and placing it where she would find it alone, and the message under the message, whatever it was, reached the animal part of her before her mind could parse it, and told her one clear thing: they know where you are, and they want you to be afraid. She was still shaking when she called Lucian and asked him to meet her, and he came, and she chose the lakefront park because she needed the open air, and the cold and the distance from walls, and she showed him the matches and the scorched menu, and watched his face change as he looked at them, watched something dark and knowing move behind his eyes that frightened her almost as much as the thing itself. "What is this?" she demanded. "What does it mean? Who leaves a burned menu on a woman's counter?" And Lucian's jaw had gone tight and he said, carefully, too carefully, "I do not know yet, but I will find out." And Wren heard the lie of omission in it, heard that he knew more than he was saying, and 2 years of exhaustion and fear came up out of her all at once. "You knew," she said. "Not this, maybe, but this world. You knew what being seen next to you would cost. You took my hand in front of all those people and you knew, and now someone is leaving me pieces of the worst thing that ever happened to my family, and you are standing there telling me you do not know, and I am so tired, Lucian. I am so tired of things being done to me. I came into your house to feed you so I could save my brother, and somehow I have ended up a target in a war I do not even understand." He took a step toward her, his voice low. "Wren, let me protect you." And he reached out to touch her face, the way a man reaches for someone he cannot stand to see in pain, and her body did the thing it had always done, the thing it did before her heart could vote. She flinched back, hard, out of his reach, and she saw the exact moment it landed, saw the hurt cross his face raw and unguarded before the mask could catch it, the look of a man who had let one person close in 24 years and just watched her recoil from his hand, and she hated herself for it, and could not take it back. "I have to go," she said, her voice breaking, and he said her name, once, quietly, but she was already turning, already walking fast toward the gray lake with her father's burned menu clutched against her chest, running the way she always ran when someone got close enough to matter, and behind her Lucian Ferrante stood alone on the frozen path with his hand still half raised in the empty air. And he did not follow her, because he knew, with a cold and growing certainty, that the thing on her counter had not come from a stranger, that it carried a signature only he could read, and that the danger she was running from was not out there in the world at all. It was inside his own house, wearing an old man's face and waiting. The burned menu would not let her sleep, and so Wren did the thing her fear had been circling for days. She started asking questions, quietly, of the old people from the old neighborhood who still remembered when Callahan stood on the corner, and at first, They gave her only the soft version she had grown up with. A terrible accident, faulty wiring, a tragedy. But the burned menu sat in her bag like a coal, and she kept pulling at the thread. And one evening an old man who had run the hardware store 2 doors down looked at her for a long time, and then looked away, and said, in a low voice, "Girl, some fires are not accidents. Some fires are messages. And when your father would not pay what they were asking, they sent one." And Wren sat very still and asked who they were. And the old man would not say the name out loud. He only said, "The people who ran this part of the city back then, the ones who run it still, you do not say their name." And she went home and could not breathe. And she found herself pulling out the old box she had never been able to throw away. The fragments the insurance investigators had left behind. The reports she had been too young to read and too heartbroken to read since. And now she read them with a grown woman's eyes. And between the careful official lines she saw what a frightened child had never been shown. The word suspicious. The word accelerant. The note that the family had reported threats in the weeks before. Threats that had gone nowhere because the people making them owned the rooms where such complaints were heard. And the last thing she needed clicked into place with a horror so total it hollowed her out. Because she knew now whose part of the city that had been, whose it still was, whose house she had been walking into every morning with her mother's knives to cook breakfast for the man she had let herself begin to love. She did not remember the drive. She only remembered standing in the great cold entrance hall of the Ferrante house with her coat still on and the old reports crushed in her fist, and Lucian coming toward her with something already breaking in his face, because he had seen her expression and understood, and she held up the papers and said, in a voice she did not recognize, "The fire, my father's shop. It was you. It was your family, your people. Tell me it is not true. Tell me and I will believe you. Please, just tell me it is not true." And he did not. That was the thing that ended her, worse than any words could have, that he stood there in his own house with the truth in his eyes and did not deny it, because he could not, because he had spent the last days in the old ledgers himself and had found the same ashes she had, and all he said, low and wrecked, was, "Wren, I did not know. I swear to you I did not know until now. It was before." It was. And she did not let him finish. Because before did not matter. Because the machine that had killed her father and stolen her brother's breath and burned down the whole of her childhood was the same machine that put the suits on his back and the guards at his gate. And she had eaten from it. She had smiled across a table at it. She had flinched from its hand at the lake and cried for having heard it. "My father died in that fire," she said, and her voice was terribly quiet now, the quiet on the far side of screaming. "My brother is dying right now, tonight, of the smoke he breathed carrying me out of it. And I have been standing in your kitchen falling in love with you, and the whole time, you and everyone like you were the reason there was a fire to carry me out of." Lucian took a step toward her, his hand rising the way it had at the lake. "Wren, please, let me." And she backed away from him, and there were no tears now. She was past tears. She was in the cold, clear country beyond them. And she said, do not you dare say let me. There is nothing you can give me that your family did not first take." And she turned, and this time she did not run. Running was for fear, and she was not afraid anymore. She simply walked, straight-backed and steady, across the cold, beautiful hall, and out the great door into the falling snow, and she did not look back. Not once. Not at the house. Not at the man standing broken in the middle of it. Not at the small warm kitchen where a dead woman's recipes had almost, for a little while, made 2 orphans believe they could be a home, and behind her Lucian Ferrante stood alone among the ashes of the only good thing he had let himself want, and understood that he had lost her, and that he had lost her to a crime he had not committed but would spend the rest of his life belonging to. After she was gone, Lucian did not sleep at all. He went down into the locked room where his father's old business had been kept. The real books, the ones the accountants never saw, the long handwritten ledgers in which men like his father had recorded the ugly arithmetic of the city they ran, who paid and who refused, And what happened to the ones who refused? And he sat under a single lamp and turned the brittle pages back through the years, toward the one he was looking for. And somewhere in this cold and patient search, a strange thing is worth pausing on. So if you have read this far, and your heart is with Wren tonight, type the word Chicago in the comments. Only the ones who truly followed the story will understand. And now let us go back to the man bent over the ledger in the dark. He found it near the bottom of a page in his father's hard, slanting hand, a line as ordinary as all the other lines around it. A date, an address on the south side he now knew by heart, a family name that read Callahan, and beside it, a single notation that meant, in the flat, cruel shorthand of that world, that the debt had been settled by fire, and beneath the entry, as was the custom in those books, the initials of the man who had carried the order out. And Lucian stared at those two letters until the lamp seemed to dim. S and B. Salvatore Bianchi, the old fixer who had served his father, who had helped raise the machine Lucian inherited, who had stood in this very house a week ago, with eyes like cold coins, and let his gaze linger on a girl in the doorway of a kitchen that had been closed for a generation. The anger that came was not the hot kind. Lucian had been raised out of hot anger long ago. It was the cold kind. The kind that arrives quietly and settles into the bones and does not leave. The kind that had made his family what it was, and that he had spent his whole life fearing he carried. And he sat with it a long time. And under his shirt his hand found the small worn medal of St. Christopher and closed around it hard enough to leave its shape in his palm. His mother's medal, the patron of travelers, of the road home. And he thought of Elena in her kitchen, and of what she had wanted for him, the soft side of a hard world, and he understood that he had come to the exact crossroads she had died hoping he would reach, as a better man than his father. Because there were two roads, and he could see them both clearly. There was the road he had been born to, the one that said the family is the family, and its old sins are buried with the men who committed them, that Salvatore Bianchi had spilled blood for the Ferrantes for 40 years, and was owed silence, that a woman who had learned a dangerous truth was a loose thread, and loose threads get pulled, that the smart cold move, the move his father would have made without losing a night's sleep, was to let the old man handle the girl, the way the old man handled everything, and keep the peace, and keep the power, and keep the door shut on tenderness forever. And there was the other road, the one with no protection on it at all, the one that meant turning on his own house, breaking the oldest law he had, dragging a buried crime into the light where it could not be controlled, choosing a girl who had just walked out of his life, and would very likely never walk back into it, over the family that had made him everything he was. And he knew what it would cost. He knew it might cost him the organization and the loyalty of men who had feared him, and possibly his life. And he chose it anyway. In the cold hour before dawn, with his mother's medal biting into his hand, he chose the road she had wanted for him, because he had finally been given something worth losing everything to be worthy of, even if he never got to keep it. But he was not the only one awake in the dark that night, and he was not the only one who had felt the ground move, because old men who have survived as long as Salvatore Bianchi survive, precisely because they can smell it when a boss goes quiet in a certain way, and Sal had felt the temperature of the house change, had noticed the locked room opened, had understood from a lifetime of reading the wind that his young Dawn had stopped being distracted by the girl and started being dangerous about her, and Sal did not wait to be sure. Waiting to be sure was how careful men died. He moved first, the way he always had, making his own quiet calls to his own loyal capos, telling them the boy had gone soft and softer than soft, compromised, unfit, that a leader who would turn on his own blood over an old fire and a bakery girl was a leader who had already stopped being one, and that the kindest thing, the necessary thing, was to remove the weakness before it spread, both of them, the boy and the girl. And Salvatore Bianchi hung up the phone and looked out at the snow coming down over the city he had helped run for 40 years, and he decided, with the calm of a man who had made such decisions before, that it would happen soon, on a night when the storm was bad enough to cover it, and that he would begin, as he had begun once before with this same family, with a fire he could aim at whatever the boy loved most. For 3 days Wren did not go to the house, and Lucian did not come to the counter, and she told herself the silence was mercy, that some wounds are cleaner left alone, and then on the 4th evening, as she was locking up the Sunrise Bakery in the empty after-hours hush of the terminal, she looked up and he was there, standing a careful distance back the way a man stands when he knows he no longer has the right to come closer. And he did not try to explain, and he did not say "let me." He only crossed the quiet space between them and set a plain envelope on the clean steel of her counter, the same counter where a burned menu had once been left to frighten her. And he said, "This is yours. It was always going to be yours. I only moved it back to where it belonged." And then he stepped away again, giving her room, giving her the choice. She opened it with hands that did not want to, and inside were papers, legal and formal and stamped, and it took her a moment to understand what she was reading, because her mind refused it at first. A deed, the deed to a corner lot on the south side. She knew better than her own name. And beneath it photographs of the building as it stood now, rebuilt, the brick clean, the windows whole, the hand-painted sign restored above the door in the old script, Callahan's, her father's shop risen out of its own ashes, and her name alone, written where the owner's name goes. She could not speak. She turned the pages and found more. A second set of documents she did not immediately understand until she saw her brother's name, and then the careful language explaining that the cost of his surgery and everything around it had been quietly taken care of, not as a place bought on any list. He had been direct about that in a note in that hard, precise hand. No one buys their way past the sick. I did not, and I would not. But the expense removed, the burden lifted, and Elliot moved to the best transplant center in the country, to be evaluated honestly, on his merits, by the people most able to help him, given at last the fair chance that being poor had been quietly stealing from him for 2 years. And under all of it, at the bottom of the envelope, was one more thing. A copy of an old ledger page in a hard, slanting hand that was not Lucian's. A date, and an address, and her family's name, and 2 initials. And a second sheet, in Lucian's own writing naming the man those initials belonged to, laying the whole buried truth bare, sparing himself nothing, handing her the weapon that could burn his own house down, and trusting her to hold it. She looked up at him, and her eyes were full, and she did not know what she felt. It was too large and too tangled to name. Grief and fury, and something that would not stop reaching toward him, no matter how hard she pulled it back. "Why?" she managed. "Why would you do this? Give me the thing that can destroy you." And Lucian looked at her across the small distance he had left between them, and for once, there was no armor in his face at all. Nothing held back. "Because I cannot give you your father," he said quietly, "and I cannot give your brother back the years he spent in that smoke, and I cannot undo a fire that was set before I was old enough to stop it. Those things are gone, and no amount of anything I have will buy them back. I know that. So I gave you the only things I could, your father's door open again, your brother's fair chance, and the truth, all of it, even the part that ends me, because you deserve to hold it and decide what to do with it." He paused, and the last of it came out lower, steadier, the plainest thing he had ever said to her. "I have lied to a great many people in my life, Wren. It is most of what my life has been, but I never once lied to you about what you are to me. Not at the counter, not at the table, not at the lake, not for a single moment, and I am not saying it now to ask you for anything. I gave you all of this with no string on it. You owe me nothing and I expect nothing. I only needed you to know it was true before you decide never to see me again." And then he did the hardest thing, the thing that told her more than any of the rest. He did not wait for her answer. He did not press. He simply inclined his head the way he had the first night she agreed to dinner, and he turned and walked away across the empty terminal and left her standing alone at her counter, with her father's shop in her hands, and the whole ruined truth in her lap. And Wren stood there long after the sound of his footsteps had gone, holding the deed against her chest the way she had once held a burned menu, except that this time, what she was holding was not a threat, but a homecoming, and she understood, with a terror greater than any fear the old men in coats had ever put in her, that she was not finished loving him at all. The storm that Salvatore Bianchi had been waiting for came 3 nights later, the worst of the winter, the kind that empties the streets and muffles the city under a white and total silence, and it arrived at the same hour as the phone call Wren had been dreading for 2 years, the hospital telling her that her brother had taken a sudden hard turn, that his lungs were failing faster than anyone could hold, that she needed to come now, and she was already pulling on her coat with her heart in her throat, when the second thing happened, the thing she had no way to expect. The power in her building died all at once, and she smelled it before she understood it. Smoke, curling thin and gray under her own front door, and she understood with the animal clarity of someone who had smelled that exact smoke as a child, that it was not an accident, that history was repeating itself on purpose, that the same evil which had taken her father was reaching for her now in the same way. And she got out into the freezing stairwell coughing and shaking with the deed to her father's shop still in her bag, and her brother dying across the city, and men she did not recognize waiting in the dark at the bottom of the stairs. And in that moment of pure trapped terror, there was only one name her hand found on the phone, only one person in the whole world she called: Lucian. He answered on the first ring because he had not been sleeping, because he was in the middle of the most dangerous night of his own life, sitting across a table from the old capos he had summoned with the ledger page open between them, laying Salvatore Bianchi's 40 years of buried sins bare before the men whose loyalty would decide everything, making the coldest and most necessary argument of his life, that a man who set fires on families, and now moved against the blood of his own Don, had broken every law that held them together, and forfeited his place among them, and he was winning that terrible quiet war. He could see it turning in the old men's faces, when Wren's name lit his phone, and he heard the smoke in her voice, and the fear she had never once let him hear before. And he stood up in the middle of the most important meeting of his life, and walked out of it, because there was no version of him left that would choose the family over her, and he said into the phone, low and steady, the voice that made people believe him, "I am coming. Do not go back inside. Stay where there are people. Keep talking to me. I am already on my way." What followed, Wren would never be able to tell in order. It came to her in fragments: the cold of the street, the headlights of his car coming too fast through the blinding snow, the door thrown open, the men in the dark who scattered when they saw whose car it was, because even Sal's people had not been told they were moving against the Don himself, only against a girl, and the discovery that a thing they thought was small had teeth they had not counted on. There was a struggle in the snow that she would remember more as noise and motion than as anything she could describe. Shouting and the wrench of bodies, and Lucian putting himself between her and the dark without a moment's hesitation. And then his men were there. Tom's men, the loyal ones, arriving the way the tide arrives, and it was over almost before it began. The danger folding, the figures in the dark going still, and then going with the men who came for them, and none of it was the thing she carried away from that night anyway. The thing she carried away was after, when the chaos had emptied out of the street, and left only the two of them standing in the falling snow, and she was shaking so hard she could not speak. The smoke and the terror, and her brother dying somewhere across the city, all crashing through her at once, and Lucian crossed to her, and did the thing he had never once allowed himself to do. He reached up slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and when she did not, he laid his hand against the back of her neck the way her mother once had, the way his mother once had, the gesture that had started all of it, and he drew her in against him and held her, and he said into her hair, low and certain, "You're home now. You're safe. Everything is going to be all right," giving her back her own lullaby at last. And Wren broke against his chest and let herself, for the first time in her whole life, be carried. But there was no time to stay there, because Elliot was dying, and Lucian felt her remember it in the way her body went rigid, and he did not ask questions. He simply moved, and the same machine that had once been used to burn her family became, in that hour, the thing that saved what was left of it. because a man with Lucian Ferrante's reach could do what a frightened sister with an old car could not. He could clear the frozen roads, he could get her across a paralyzed city faster than any ambulance could crawl, and when they reached the hospital and learned that a matching pair of lungs had become available that very night, that the only question was whether Elliot could be gotten to the transplant center in time, through a storm that had grounded everything, Lucian made 3 calls and a medical flight that no one else in the city could have summoned was warming its engines within the hour. No line jumped, no sick stranger pushed aside, only the one thing money and power can honestly buy: speed. The frozen distance erased, the golden window held open by force of logistics alone. And so Wren spent the longest night of her life in a hospital waiting room, with the most feared man in Chicago sitting beside her, not speaking, just there, his shoulder against hers through every unbearable hour. And at some point in the gray before dawn, she watched him take the small, worn medal of St. Christopher from around his own neck, the last thing he had of his mother, the patron of travelers and of coming home, and press it into her brother's hand before they wheeled him away, so that a stranger's son would carry Elena Ferrante's blessing into the dark. And Wren looked at the man who had given away the only piece of his mother he had left, to a dying man he had every reason to leave to fate, and understood that whatever he had been born into, this was who he had chosen to be. The surgeon came out a little after dawn with the particular tiredness of a person carrying good news, and said the words Wren had stopped letting herself imagine, that it had gone well, that her brother had come through, that the new lungs had taken and Elliot was breathing, truly breathing, for the first time in years, and Wren did not remember standing up. She only knew that the strength went out of her legs, and that instead of the cold floor she found Lucian, that he had risen with her and caught her, and this time, she did not flinch and she did not run. She turned into him and wrapped her arms around him and held on, and it was nothing like that first mistaken embrace in the terminal. There was no confusion in it, and no stranger in it. She knew exactly whose chest she was pressed against, and exactly what she was doing. She was holding the man who had stayed, and she wept into his coat. But they were not the old, ugly, solitary tears from the car outside the emergency room. They were the other kind, the kind you can only cry when someone is finally there to catch them. When she could stand again, he did not let go until she was ready. And later, when Elliot was sleeping and the ward had gone quiet, the two of them slipped out to a small enclosed garden off the recovery floor, where the snow had finally stopped, and the sky over Chicago was going pale and clean with morning. And they stood there in the cold new light, not saying anything, because everything that had happened was too large for small talk, and it was Wren who broke it, Wren who had run every time before, and this time she did not run. This time she turned to him and reached up and kissed him, deciding it herself, choosing it with her eyes open, and Lucian went still the way he had gone still that first night at the airport. But it was a different stillness now, not the stillness of an old wound reopening, but of a man afraid to believe a thing he wanted too much. And he did not grab for it. He let her lead. He waited. He had waited this whole time, and only when she did not pull away did he lift his hand and lay it against the side of her face, as gently as if she might break. When they parted, she kept her forehead against his and breathed, and then she asked the question that mattered, quietly, the same shape of question the story had been circling from the start. Does this change anything? And he answered it the only honest way there was. It only changes if you want it to, and she felt the freedom he was handing her in those words, the refusal to decide it for her, and she understood that this was what he had been offering all along. Not rescue, not ownership, but the one thing no one had ever given her, the room to choose. But she needed to know what she would be choosing, and so she made herself ask the harder thing. And I cannot love a man who does what your family did, Lucian. I will not raise anything or build anything on top of that fire. And he nodded, because he had known this was the price, and had already decided to pay it, and he told her, standing in the snow-lit garden, what he had set in motion during that longest night, and the days around it, that Salvatore Bianchi and the men who moved with him would answer for what they had done, through channels that would hold, that the old machine his father built was already being dismantled from the inside, its uglier arms cut off, Its business turned toward the light. The hotels and the buildings, and the legitimate blood of it kept, and the rest of it ended. That it would take time, and it would make him enemies, and it might cost him a great deal. But that he was done being the thing the city whispered about. That he had found something he wanted to be worthy of, more than he wanted to be feared. "And there is one more thing you should know," he said, "because it belongs to the old life, and I am closing the old life. There was an arrangement once, a marriage the families expected of me. Gia, a merger dressed as a wedding, and I ended it, cleanly and for good, the night I understood that the only person I have ever wanted to come home to is a woman who gives strangers her breakfast and hides it." Wren looked at him for a long moment. This man the whole city feared, standing in a hospital garden at dawn, having given away his mother's medal to save her brother and his family's oldest law to deserve her, offering her not a cage of comfort, but an open door, and she felt the last of the fear she had carried her whole life. The fear of being carried, of being owned, of being one more person things were done to, finally loosen its grip, because this was not that. This had never been that. And so she did the thing that closed the circle, the thing that had started all of it by accident, and would begin all of it now on purpose. She stepped in close, and slid her hand up to the back of his neck, deliberately this time, knowing exactly whose neck it was, and she pressed her palm there, the way two dead mothers had once pressed theirs, and she whispered the words back to him, the words he had given her in the snow. "You're home now. You're safe. Everything is going to be all right." And she felt the last of the ice go out of him under her hand, and the man who had let no one close in 24 years closed his eyes and let himself, at last, be home. Spring came slowly to Chicago, the way it always did, in stubborn inches, and by the time the snow finally gave up its hold on the city, Elliot was walking the length of the block without stopping to rest, then 2 blocks, then all the way to the corner where a certain shop stood, with fresh brick and clean windows and a hand-painted sign restored above the door. And on a bright morning in April, Wren turned the key in the lock of Callahan's for the first time as its owner, and stood in the middle of the floor her father had once stood on, and let herself cry the good kind of tears, because the dream she had kept so small it could not hurt her, had grown back into a real thing she could stand inside. She rebuilt it slowly, and she rebuilt it herself, but she was not alone the way she had always been alone, because Lucian was there, quietly, at the edges of it, moving crates and painting walls and calling himself, with a straight face, her business partner, and when she teased him that the most feared man in the city had no earthly reason to spend his evenings learning to knead dough badly in a Southside bakery, he looked at her over the flour he had somehow gotten on his face and said, "I only needed an excuse to stay near you, and I intend to keep using it," and she laughed and did not argue, because she had stopped being afraid of the ways he chose to stay. He was a terrible baker. He was patient about being terrible, which she found she loved even more. This controlled and dangerous man letting himself be clumsy at something for the first time in his life just to stand beside her while she did the thing she was made for, and the little kitchen filled again with the smell of cinnamon and warm bread the way Elena's kitchen had. Ashes turned all the way back into a home. And it was there, on an ordinary evening with a tray of rolls just out of the oven, and the light going gold in the windows, that Lucian took her flour-dusted hand in his, and got down in front of her without any of the grandeur the city would have expected of a man like him, and opened a small box with a plain and simple ring inside. Nothing that shouted. Nothing that owned. Just a promise. And he said, "I have spent my whole life being the coldest thing in every room I walked into." And then a woman put her hand on the back of my neck by mistake and gave me back the one warm thing I thought was gone forever. "You brought me home. Wren, you took a man who had no home left in him and you gave him one. Marry me. Not because it makes sense, and not because I deserve it, but because I do not want to spend a single morning of the rest of my life without you in it." And Wren, who had learned to expect nothing and carry everything, looked at the man kneeling in her father's shop and said yes, without a moment's hesitation, and pulled him up into a kiss that tasted of cinnamon and beginnings. They were married that summer in the shop itself, small and warm, and full of the smell of fresh bread. No ballroom, no families in their cold jewels, only the people who truly loved them. And Elliot, breathing easy and strong at last, walked his sister down the short aisle they had cleared between the tables her father had once served. And when they reached the front, he placed her hand in Lucian's and did not let go until he was sure, older brother sure. And then he stepped back smiling, and at the moment the vows were done, Lucian reached into his pocket and drew out the small worn medal of St. Christopher, returned to him by a grateful family the day Elliot came home from the hospital, and he fastened it gently around Wren's neck, the last thing his mother had given him, the patron of travelers and of coming home, passing it at last to the woman who had made the word home mean something again. And late that night, when the guests had gone, and the shop was quiet, and the ovens had cooled, and it was only the two of them left in the warm dark of the place, where both their old lives had ended, and their new one had begun, Wren stepped close to her husband, and slid her hand up to the back of his neck, deliberately, gently, the gesture that had started everything, no longer a wound and no longer a ghost, but simply a homecoming, and she whispered the words one more time, "You're home now. You're safe. Everything is going to be all right." And Lucian closed his eyes and rested his forehead against hers, and answered her softly, "Thank you for bringing me home." And that is where we leave them, the warmest heart in the city, and the man who was once its coldest, finally, and for the rest of their lives, home. If this story touched something in you, we would love for you to let us know. Tell us in the comments how it made you feel, and give it a score from 0 to 10, so we know whether Wren and Lucian found their way into your heart, the way we hoped they would. If you enjoyed it, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, and to like and share this video, so that more people can find these stories, and so that we can keep bringing you a new one every single day. We read every comment, and we truly want to hear what you felt, deep in your heart, as you listened, because these stories are made for you. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. We wish every single one of you watching good health, a peaceful mind, and a life full of small joys each and every day. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and we will see you in the next video.